Scott Frost has shut down any QB competition talk this week, which means AB3 is QB1.
You are Locked On UCF, your daily podcast on the UCF Knights, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on in to Locked On UCF, your daily UCF podcast. I'm your host, Mike G. Thank you so much for making us your first listen of every single day and for making Locked On the #1 podcast network out there talking college football. Turn us up, turn us all, turn it out. I'm here with my good friend James Duncan to talk a little UCF football here on a Thursday evening. On today's show, we're going to talk about some comments that Scott Frost had about his QB competition. I love this. And then we're going to talk about something else that was talked about by the GM, Trent Mossbrucker, in evaluating talent versus potential and production. There were some very interesting comments that I want to go over there today. And then we're going to talk about Scott and Trent working together on building the roster. Who's the real architect of UCF football? All that and more on today's show. This show is brought to you by our title sponsor, Game Time. Download the Game Time app today. Use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Let's jump into our conversation. James, before we started recording, you and I were talking about comments Scott Frost made to the media about Alonza Barnett III. I think we're calling him AB3. Are we calling him AB3? AB3?
We're calling him AB3.
Okay.
It just sounds so nice. AB3, QB1. It just makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if he's going to be torching defenses. I don't know. I think something in the area of third-degree burns. Like,
oh, yeah. It's gonna something's gonna click.
Something's gonna click there. So we hope that he is a flaming defenses in 2026. Scott Frost hopes so too, which is why he came out and said, "Look, man, he's our quarterback." Now, something we talk about on this show is the benefit of having an actual QB competition. Iron sharpens iron. I stand by that. However, I like that they know who their guy is early. I don't think last year they said it was a competition. Ultimately, we saw that it was a competition, right? Because when Cam Fancher got hurt, Taven Jackson took over, and they did not immediately go back to Taven Jackson. To Cam Fancher. They stuck with Taven for most of the season. And I think it validates what Scott Frost said about it being really close and them having, guys that they felt like, had their own strengths, but could lead UCF football on offense in their own specific ways. Alonza Barnett III comes in, though, highly, highly decorated. And, when we talked about our top 5 QBs, I want to remind everybody of what we said here. This was my top 5 QBs. Chaos. Yes, I think Alonza Barnett potentially is the second best QB in the Big 12 in 2026. James, you had, I'm sorry, I don't think I had your list here. Oh, no, I do have your list. James, this is your list. You had Brendan Sorsby there, but you felt like Alonza Barnett tied for 5th with Drew Mestamaker. And look, Andrew felt kind of like you felt, except for he said no tie at 5th, and he feels like Alonza Barnett III definitely has a chance to move up that list here. So when you bring a guy like him in, I just think, hey, man, for the money that it probably cost you to get him, let's not pretend like there's some QB battle. He's the guy. And I think this is a good thing for UCF that they're settling on the guy early, because you can start molding the identity of your team offensively around him faster.
Yeah, no, I like that he shut it down real quick and said, hey, this is our guy, and QB 2 and 3 is going to be the battle. And I don't think that should be an underrated battle, considering how many, times in the past couple of seasons that we've had a QB 2 or 3 come onto the field and play meaningful snaps. I think QB 2 is an unbelievably important position, especially for the Knights that have had so much QB trouble in the past couple of years. I'm really interested to see who ends up taking, kind of a step forward in that department. I think, my guesses would be on Kewan Jenkins from FIU, who, we kind of dedicated an entire episode to talking about. He was a 3-year starter there. I think he comes in and gives you veteran experience at QB2. It's nice to have multiple guys that have had multiple years of starting experiences, whether, G5 or, FCS, whatever it is, that you feel comfortable about in your QB room. I think most UCF fans will say that this is probably the most comfortable they've felt with their QB room in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I would agree. Look, man, Alonza Barnett III is the guy. He's a guy that we think has a chance to climb the QB ranks in the Big 12 here. But, we asked a question, and I asked Andrew a question that I don't think I got a chance to ask you about fit and whether or not Alonza Barnett III is a better fit than most of his QB1 peers at other schools next year, right? The marriage of system, coach, and QB in 2026 with Alonza Barnett III, Scott Frost and McKenzie Milton and against what other people are doing, I think has a chance to be fairly prolific. Is this the prototypical Scott Frost quarterback?
Yeah, no, I think it definitely is. And I think something that was really important that they referenced in the not post game, but the press conferences today that they had about the transfer portal was that they just talked about how much of a culture fit this guy was. And it is so important when you're talking about culture in a QB room, because there needs to be a level of zero toxicity in that room to where guys are helping each other up. They're talking to each other. There's active communication. There's positive communication. There's picking, your brother up to your left and your right and moving on to the next play. It's so important as a QB to kind of have that backbone and to kind of have those guys in the room with you that are going to benefit you. I think not only is he a great culture fit, but if you go and you look at his film and guys, I just want to let you know, we're going to try and maybe see if we can get some film at some point, maybe look at some stuff. I know that, a lot of people would love us to look at that. And so we're going to do our best, but this guy's game film says it all. And he is a winner, and he knows how to get out of the pocket and scramble. That's why he had hundreds of rushing yards and 15 touchdowns on the ground. Scott Frost and McKenzie Milton need a guy that isn't scared to get active with his legs, but also knows when he needs to air it out. I think AB3 is the perfect fit for you.
Yeah, look, they're confident in this one. They like this pick, and you need your guy. You got to have your guy. I don't think that they took what they could get in year one, right? I think in year two, they've got who they want. I honestly believe that. I think they have who they want here. And that's no shot at Cam or Taven. But let's be honest, Alonza Barnett III is a extreme step up here from those guys. Look, this conversation about Alonza Barnett takes us to our next topic about evaluating talent versus potential. And it's something we talk about a lot on this show, but given some of the comments that we got today, I want to dive further into the conversation about how UCF is going to evaluate talent moving forward with NIL being such a big factor in the conversation. We'll talk about that next, right here on Locked On UCF.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kalia Butler, host of Locked On Women's Basketball, and this is Mazda's Women's Basketball Snapshot, celebrating the work no highlight reel can ever capture. The WNBA has released its 2026 schedule, featuring a 44-game regular season beginning on Friday, May 8th. The league's historic 30th season includes expansion teams Portland Fire and the Toronto Tempo, with opening weekend highlights such as Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever hosting Paige Beckers and the Dallas Wings, and a rematch of the 2025 finals between the Aces and the Mercury. In college hoops, South Carolina handed Vanderbilt its first loss of the season with a dominant 103-74 win. These moments are earned off the clock, those long before the lights ever come on. The sweat, the fakes, the doubt, the scrapes, and coming back for more every time. Mazda puts the same drive into every detail. Wins define the moment. Putting in the work, that defines you. There's more to a Mazda because there's more to you.
James, evaluating talent versus potential, and figuring out hopefully what your other coaching peers can't figure out. Now, we talked about what the approach to roster management needs to be in Scott Frost's first couple of years here until you have real proof of concept. And I told you, I said, look, they may not have had a lot of success on offense, but one thing that happened was I think they showed enough of what they want to do to be able to go out and say, look, Alonza, we're going to let you throw the ball here. And if you don't believe us, just look at the tape. It wasn't successful because we didn't have you. Now that we have you, it will be successful. And and then once you are successful, then you got an even stronger pitch to go out and say, hey, look, come to UCF because we took Alonza Barnett and all the great things that he did at JMU, and then we sent him to the league. All right, this is the system that can get you there. With hiring GMs signals a change in how teams look at talent acquisition. It's not just looking at high school tape anymore. There are a lot of very complex decisions they have to make. Is UCF taking the right approach here? It's not just Scott Frost anymore. Like, he's got to be willing to collaborate with others in terms of roster management and building a roster here. Do you think he's doing it the right way?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a good fusion, and I know that we're going to talk about that on our last segment, but I think Scott is really working hard to kind of find the balance between guys that have raw talent that haven't gotten to the field much, and then finding guys that, have a lot of production. One specific guy that he mentioned was Landon Chambers from Central Arkansas, who over the past couple of years is, specifically 2025, 242 carries, 1,200 plus yards, 10 touchdowns, averaging 5.3 yards a carry. Guy was an absolute bell cow, which is a great thing to have when you can hand it off to a guy 240 plus times in a season and he's going to come out the other end okay. They kind of talked about him being this like production like masterpiece of somebody that has gotten a lot of production. Now they want to build him up. They want to get him even stronger. They want to get him even bigger so that he can play at the Power 5 level, and they really think that he can. And I think that it's a good show of balancing that, right? Because you saw guys that they have like Tavion Swint, where that's still just raw potential. That's still raw talent, but they really, really did their best to retain him because believe me, that kid if he wanted to go somewhere else, he could have gone somewhere else. But they worked really hard to retain Tavion Swint, who was doing really well in spring ball last year, and then obviously had that season-ending injury. So right now, I think the running back room is like a perfect room to look at if you want, kind of a display of what you hope the entire team looks like. You've got one guy that's given you tons of production in Landon Chambers. You have one guy that's kind of the halfway between, the good balance, the good mix, Duke Watson from Louisville, who had a really good freshman season. Last year gets injured. So he's kind of that between of, no, this past year he didn't have a ton of production, but he's got a ton of talent, and you've seen that before. And then you've got Tavion Swint, who has tons of talent, but you haven't seen any production out of him. I think that's a perfect room to look at of what you want the entire team to be, because it's an important thing to have a balance and a mix of these guys, because sometimes production at the FCS or D2 or even G5 level doesn't translate. And those guys just have production because they had one good season. And sometimes raw talent is going to absolutely take over. And you can have a true freshman pop off. I think a guy that, people are really looking forward to is Tyron in the wide receiver room.
Mm-hmm.
The 4-star that they went out and got, kind of late. He signed at the, Under Armour All-American game. That's a guy that people are really excited about. You've already seen guys like Waden kind of pop off and Dwayne Thomas pop off and Dylan Wade. So you have these guys that have production behind their belts. I think looking forward to the next season, you want to find this balance of talent, potential, and then the guys that are kind of in between. And I think that's exactly what Scott Frost did this offseason. I think the only place where people are going to be maybe a little upset where, there were some crucial needs, and I think people don't really think we found them was that offensive line.
Yeah, look, when you talk about, you made a comment about what translates sometimes from FCS to FBS. Obviously, there are a few kids right now making that jump from FCS to FBS this offseason, and teams are rolling the dice on whether or not it's going to translate, whether they can take those skills in a better system with better talent around them and be better. So, Alonza Barnett III, one of those notable names, but, obviously Mestamaker is another name making the jump from the American up. And then you've got guys like Byron Brown trying to do the exact same thing, right? The other two are doing. So there are a few names here in the portal this offseason that we'll see who made the best bet, right? Did UCF make the best bet on Barnett, right? Was Mestamaker the best bet? Did Auburn make the best bet on Byron Brown? Fit has a lot to do with it. And if you're evaluating talent better than your peers, you have a chance to really surprise people. And we're going to move on, but I do want to say this about these guys and why I think sometimes it could really pay dividends for you, if you're searching for your guy and your first-year coach at your school. These incumbents that got recruited to like Texas and Alabama, and they've been told they're the best their whole life. Sometimes, man, these dudes rest on their laurels and they're just a little bit too confident in their own ability. And you get guys coming from the FCS who feel like they have something to prove. They feel like, hey, look, man, I was in the American last year, but I can play in the SEC. I can play in the Big 12.
I think it's really important to find a guy with a chip on his shoulder and to, find a guy that really wants to prove himself. I think that UCF found a ton of those guys in the offseason. I think we've, went a little bit of a different route last year, especially at quarterback. We went with Taven, who kind of bounced around Power 5 schools and, didn't do so hot, everywhere he landed. Really nice guy, and I'm sure he was good for culture. Cam was also a guy that bounced around, G5 schools and, started at a bunch of different places, but we never really found our fit last year. I think them going out and getting two proven, productive G5 QBs that, one of them, went to the college football playoff, which is not what most teams in the Big 12 cannot say, that they have a quarterback that is starting for them next year that went to the college football playoff. Yeah. You can't. So, I think a lot of UCF fans feel really comfortable about the talent that's on the team. Like I said, I think the only sore spot for a lot of people is probably O-line.
Yeah, I agree. Look, man, look at the top 5 list. A bunch of bums and Alonza Barnett III. That's what I'm saying. I'm just kidding. It's a really good list. A really good list of quarterbacks. Let's get to the break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about Scott Frost and Trent Mossbrucker working together to build this roster. Can those guys do it effectively? We'll talk about that next, right here on Locked On UCF. This episode of Locked On UCF is brought to you by our title sponsor, Game Time. There's nothing like being in an NBA arena. The crowd, the energy, the moment. Getting tickets, though, that part hasn't always been so simple. That's why Game Time has become the go-to app for scoring tickets fast without the hassle. It puts the advantage back where it belongs, with the fans. Pulled up the Game Time app, pick up an upcoming NBA game, and I had tickets locked in within minutes. Loved seeing all the all-in pricing up front. No surprise fees at checkout. Being able to see the view from the panoramic seat views, guys, from your seat. Can't beat that. Great last-minute options, too, with NBA tickets showing up at solid prices. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. That's code LOCKED ON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. And remember, it's gametime.co, not .com. Also, I want to thank our friends at FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. One final Sunday, one last kickoff. The final chance to get on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. This is Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel is making sure you're right in the middle of it with a special offer in time for the biggest game of the year. Whether you're backing the favorite, riding with the underdog, or building one last same game parlay, this is the game everyone's been waiting for. This is where predictions turn into plays, stats turn into storylines, and every snap feels bigger. It's the perfect way to cap off the season and make the Super Bowl even more exciting from kickoff to final whistle. If you're a new customer, bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. Make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the season is over. Last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Scott Frost and Trent Mossbrucker, those guys have to work together. The GM, we did a segment about 5 months ago when he got hired, talking about this hire and the experience that he brings. He's been around football and talent for a long time here. So he understands evaluating from high school to major college football. But there's a money aspect to this now, and there's an investment. And coaches weirdly just want to coach football. They don't want to talk money. they just want to coach football. Mossbrucker's job is going to be to look at the big picture and look at the cap and see where they have to spend money and say, hey, I've got to get my coach the best player he can get at every position, but we got to do it on a budget. And we got to find deals, and we got to make this thing happen. And hopefully what happens is as they win, we see that budget expand here. Talk to me about Scott Frost and Trent Mossbrucker working together here, because one of the things that got said during one of these press conferences, Mossbrucker said, look, it was a little tense sometimes when we were talking about which directions to go on players. And, I wonder how those conversations are playing out. Is it just Scott and Trent in a room when these are happening? Are they in a war room where he's like, no, we got to get Alonza Barnett III? I think they agreed on Barnett III. But there could have been other players where he felt like they needed to go one direction and saw something different, and Scott Frost is seeing something different on tape.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes down to, the specifics, I think it's mostly player position coaches. And, one thing that they specifically talked about that I thought was really interesting, I didn't really know this was the way that this was done. I don't know if it's done this way at every school, but I thought it was a really, interesting nugget from that press conference was that he basically, when they go and they look at this giant pool of players, right, in the portal, everything's very quick. So those guys are working 24-hour days. They go to the player, coaches, the position coaches, and they say, hey, what do you guys look for? What do you want? What is a guy that fits in your system? How can we identify what attribute are you looking for? What skill are you looking for? Are you looking for a guy that, if it's in the D, or the linebacker room, are you looking for a guy that hits high? Are you looking for a guy that hits low? Are you looking for a guy that lurks over the middle of the field? Are you looking for a run stopper? What are you looking for? And how do you want us to identify them? What do you look for as a position coach? And they say, I look for this, this, and this, and that's what fits my system. There might be a guy out there that is more talented or, more better fit for somebody else's program, but he might be more talented or more highly touted overall. And we will go with a different guy because he fits our system and he fits what our position coaches want. And that's also where you get those deals. You find those gems. You might find a guy that if he fits in your scheme and you know how to use him right, he can be a monster. And I thought that was really interesting because I never really thought about the fact that the GMs are having to just, those guys are putting a price on everything. And it's not the coach that's saying, hey, this is what we've got. Because NIL has changed so much, and I'm not saying that coaches were ever deciding. I'm not saying that. All right. But I'm, more leaning towards the fact that position coaches have a lot of power when it comes to recruiting these guys. And it's actually the position coaches working just as much with Trent as Frost is. And Frost kind of said, I look at guys, going back to our previous segment where we talked about kind of this fusion of talent versus potential, or production versus talent. Frost said, I look at guys that are very talented. I look at raw talent. I look at what they can do, and Trent was a guy that looks for production. And he says, oh, we look at him a year before. If we're looking at FCS guys, we're looking at D2 guys. We look at those guys a year before. We look at how they're improving. If those guys end up getting in the portal, then we contact them. And I thought it was really, really, really interesting that those position coaches are working back and forth with the GM to figure out what specific attributes. And then those guys go and they watch hundreds of hours of tape, and then they go find their guys. I love it. I think it's great. I think it's a phenomenal way to approach that situation. I think the fusion is only going to get better over the next couple of years, Mike.
I can't imagine any major college football coaches letting their GM pick their quarterback, but I could see them being a little bit more vocal about other positions, though, right? Like, I mean, look, I respect, even at the pro level, right? How many coaches do you see are GM and coach? Like Bill Belichick was one of those guys who was GM and coach for a long time. But I mean, it's part of what set Nick Saban back to the college level. He wanted complete and utter control, and the Dolphins were unwilling to give it to him. And to the point where, look, man, I know he's a former UCF Knight, but like he wanted Drew Brees, and they said no, and they went in and got Dante Culpepper. And we know how that turned out. Saban was right. I mean, that guy has a crazy eye for talent, man. He's a defensive guy. He knew who he wanted. Statistically, I mean, by the numbers, Drew Brees might be the best quarterback to ever do it. Saban didn't get what he wanted, and so he said, all right, guys, I'm going back to Alabama, much to the chagrin of everybody else. I blame that GM for why we had to put up with obnoxious Alabama fans the last 20 years. But look, this conversation will be ongoing, and how this season turns out, how many of these guys turn into productive Big 12 players will tell us a lot about how Scott and Trent are handling this process together. Look, let's go on and get out of here. James, I want to thank you for joining me on today's show to talk a little UCF football. Guys, do us a favor. If you're watching this live, make sure you hit subscribe on the channel, but hit the comment section after the video and let us know what you think about Alonza Barnett III, AB3, that guy handing out third-degree burns this fall, being named starter essentially this spring. Do you think it's a good move? Would you like to see more of a competition? We want to hear from you. Thank you guys for making Locked On UCF your first listen of every day. We'll be back at you guys tomorrow with even more Locked On UCF.